College football nerds, got a team preview coming at you for the 2019 season. We've done some content in the offseason like we promised we would. A couple of them were series and not necessarily specific game related. Right now we're in the middle of a series. We're talking about the worst refereeing calls in college football history that had postseason implications. We did Oklahoma, Oregon was one that y'all haven't watched and you should because it was actually really good. And we've got another one coming later this week, Alabama versus Clemson, where Clemson won on a pick play. We discussed that and maybe in the history behind where Clemson actually picked that up. It was from some opponents that they had in years prior. But this discussion, Josh, is all about Auburn. And before we get into it, I want to remind y'all, please subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. Also hit the like button if you love it, even if we don't project your team to do as well as you might. You love it because you keep coming back. All right, Josh. Auburn had a not-so-hot year last year if you just look at the win-loss record. They had a couple of big wins, though, and one of them was starting out the season with Washington. And I argued all season long last year that, yes, there were some frustrating things that I saw from a coaching standpoint, but there were a lot of Auburn fans ready to fire Gus at the end of the year. And I want to start this discussion. And just off the bat, y'all, we're not going to talk about the quarterback situation. Everybody's going to beat that to death. And there's, we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. So until fall camps hit its stride, it's not worth speculating. I want to talk about Auburn's schedule and the fact that I guess I'm going to ask you outright, Josh. Do you foresee a situation this year, given how brutal Auburn's schedule is, that they could be a very good team and Gus Malzahn could have a very good year as a coach and still get fired only because he's not playing in a weaker league or playing a weaker schedule?
I mean, I think that's obviously something that's on the table. I mean, when you look down at their schedule in 2019, you've got Florida and Georgia on the schedule. You still have your tilts with Alabama and LSU. You got Texas A&M, and then you got the rest of the slate, which includes, by the way, Oregon in Arlington, Texas, and then other SEC teams, be it Mississippi State or Arkansas or Ole Miss, who aren't expected to be terribly good, but who knows, right? If you think Alabama and Georgia are national title caliber teams, and I'll throw LSU in that list too, because I think they're probably a little undervalued by certain people right now.
They at least have national title talent.
Right.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, then at that point you can lose those 3 games and be an extremely good team. Those are all 10-plus win teams from the year prior. They all stand to be pretty darn good this upcoming year. Defensively, all 3 of them should be very good. I think you could be a top 25 team and easily lose those 3 games. In fact, I think there's a real potential that LSU, Georgia, and Alabama are all top 10 teams come the end of the season. So, if Auburn's the 15th best team in the country, maybe you drop those 3. And if that's the case, then what are the odds that you drop one of Oregon, A&M, or Florida? I think those are probably pretty considerable. You're at 8-4. And I'm not sure how much patience there would be for 8-4, especially now if they're in that situation. We talk about a lot. Bowl games are really decided more about placement than anything, right? It's not really a good metric for saying what conference is better than another. It's usually determined whether a very good team gets a low slot or a average team gets a really high slot, and that's usually determined based off how the rest of your conference does. 8-4 Auburn probably gets an easier bowl, and just like when they face Purdue, they probably roll through them. But the end of the day, this could be an 8-4 or even 7-5 Auburn team that's actually one of the top 15 or top 20 teams in the country legitimately, right? They may only lose to top 15 teams or top 10 teams and finish 8-4, 7-5. And so if that's the situation, does Malzahn get fired? I think there's a really good chance of it, especially given the president situation at Auburn and all the turmoil there. That usually makes things it makes it less likely for him to be retained, given that the outgoing president was the one that defended him in the first place and got him this extension. And he's no longer there to defend Malzahn. I think, right out of the gate, we talk a lot about how good a team is or isn't. But when you talk about the record at the end of the year, it's unlikely Auburn's record is going to really reflect how good they are as a football team.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think last year they were a better team than they were given credit for. Look, Auburn still, to this day, hasn't gotten credit for beating the Pac-12 champion last year. The second that game was over, everybody forgot about it. But I think it's a pretty safe argument to say that if you put Auburn in the Pac-12 last year, they go 10-2, and Gus Malzahn's not on a hot seat. So the SEC and this schedule in the SEC West, especially when you have tough crossers, is kind of brutal. It's even more brutal this year because they swap out Tennessee for Florida. Everybody's high on Oregon. I don't know that Auburn could beat Oregon and still not be a great team. I think everybody's a little too high on Oregon. Whatever. Okay, so one other thing about Gus that I think is interesting is he's made the decision, which I think is the right decision. If you're going to go down swinging and control your own destiny. And so he's calling all the plays. He's running all the offense. And while I don't love this, because I think he's tried this in the past and it hasn't worked out great for him, I love it more than having 1 foot in, 1 foot out like they're doing at Michigan this year, where they've hired an offensive coordinator who's going to have a head coach whispering in his ear calling him plays. And that's what we've had, I think, a little bit at Auburn. So let's, like, if this is Gus's, poop or get off the pot moment, let him control it. And I think we saw a little bit of that in the Purdue game. But what's interesting to me, I said we're not going to talk about quarterbacks, and we're really not, but we saw last year, or at least in the Jarrett Stidham era, something that you and I have talked about for a really long time. And it's that Gus always has this gravitational pull back to kind of an air raid approach or a wanting to be a pass-first team. And we keep saying this is it. He's not going to try it anymore because it keeps failing. Do you think he has to get away from that this year, regardless of who's quarterback, and go back to a power run scheme, zone read type scheme, an offense that exploits you with gotcha moments where you're unprotected as a defense and he gets you through the air that way, than what he's tried to do the last couple of years, because he had an NFL quality quarterback and couldn't get it done through the air. So maybe talk about that a little bit and how Gus needs to change his scheme, and maybe give us a little background on where his offensive, mindset came from.
Sure. So there's a whole lot to unpack there. I'll say one last thing about the statement you made earlier. If anybody's still sort of seething for us saying, well, they could go, drop one of Oregon or Florida or Mississippi State. If you had an 80% chance of winning a game and you had an 80% chance in 4 games, you have a 60% chance of dropping one of them, just in pure odds. So that's what a compounding schedule of hard games does to you. So going back through Gus Malzahn's career, he starts at Springdale, Arkansas. He's a head coach and a famous team, and he had this quarterback named Mitch Mustain. Now, Malzahn was an accomplished author in the football space. He ran a hurry-up, no-huddle offense when it was still very much in its infancy and not a well-known thing. It was an air raid offense, more or less. It relied a lot on things like four verts. It tended to spread guys around, both side to side with lots of wide receiver screens, down the field vertically with just deep shots, and then also would pound you with a run game underneath. But it was more of a pass-first offense. And again, it was helmed by Mustain, who was a 5-star quarterback. Houston Nutt hires Gus Malzahn. He comes to Arkansas. They've got Peyton Hillis, Felix Jones, and Darren McFadden. He and Houston Nutt don't get along. Houston Nutt ends up firing him mid-season. Why? Because Gus Malzahn keeps trying to run his pass-first offense with his quarterback, Mitch Mustain. There was a whole lot of drama there. You can Google it if you want to know. Mustain ends up at USC. There's stuff with his Mustain's mother. It's a whole lot of drama, but that's Houston Nutt. Anyway, where does Malzahn end up? Well, he ends up at Tulsa under a guy named Todd Graham. And Todd Graham at Tulsa ends up at Arizona State in recent years. As people may know, he ran an inverted veer offense, and that was Graham's offense that Malzahn ended up being the offensive coordinator for. Malzahn learned how to run that style of offense and brings it to Auburn under Gene Chizik. Now, the first year at Auburn, he runs a pass-first offense with Chris Todd. It's the second year with Cam Newton where he turns to more run-first offense. Now, you can talk about whether it was being stubborn or whether it was intentional by wearing teams out, But even that year, Auburn tended to pass the ball a lot the first half and sort of move teams side to side. It at least made them tired, but they often were behind. And especially at the Mississippi State game, they learned, particularly in second halves, that if they leaned on Newton running the ball, they'd be successful. So that Mississippi State game and on, they usually would run on a tired team in the second half, and that happened again and again. It was South Carolina, it happened with Alabama, and they would run over you with Cam Newton running the inverted veer, and particularly it was a power zone scheme with Cam Newton. That has been Malzahn's MO. They have wanted to gravitate back to a pass-first offense, especially when they've had a quarterback that could throw the ball. But he's been more successful when he hasn't run his own true offensive style, but he's run the schemes that he took with Todd Graham and married that to a hurry-up, no-huddle approach. Now, I would argue it's because it forces the defense to overcompensate for the run, and when they're successful with the inverted veer, you've got a player that you don't have to block that's now accounted for, so you get an extra blocker, and it's hard for teams to keep all their assignments to be able to stop Auburn. Same thing that Oregon had success with. Tired teams struggle with the inverted veer concept. It leaves you open to a quarterback streaking down the field like Nick Marshall against Alabama. It leaves you open for deep bombs down the field, but it only works if you're being able to run the ball at a high clip and be able to move the chains, which requires you to have about 5 or 6 yards per carry. Because if you do that inverted veer offense and you aren't moving the ball well enough on the ground, everything stalls. In his system, just really, either with Todd Graham or his own natural approach, is not pro style in that it generates an open guy looking for seams and coverage. It's not built to do that, so it can't be successful in that format. But it's always important to remember that Malzahn came from a pass-first spread offense that married no-huddle elements, and he only picked up the run spread under Todd Graham. And he's been at his best, in my view, not when he's passed the ball a lot or run the ball a lot, but when he's had a quarterback that runs the ball enough to force him to be a run-first offense.
One of the things that I've noticed and have kind of harped on the last few years with Auburn is that when they're good offensively, they have a effective red zone offense, and when they're not, they're not. And you can say that about everybody, but for Gus Malzahn offenses, it really falls off. So last year they were 90th overall in red zone scoring percentage, 77th in the more important touchdown percentage, which is a little better, but it's still not great. Do you think this is an indictment on a zone read concept, even though he hasn't run that a lot lately? Or is it kind of an indictment on Malzahn, where we saw like the Clemson game a couple years ago, where basically they had Jarrett Stidham throwing, 4 verts, Madden style every play for an entire half, and it didn't work. Do you think there's something broken possibly, or that needs major overhaul in Malzahn's approach offensively to get away from what's been consistent poor red zone performance?
So I definitely think there's something there, and we talked about that preseason last year, right? That the red zone conversion percentage has been sort of an indicator of success or lack thereof. If any Auburn fans watched us early last season, we were kind of skeptical about how successful Auburn would be offensively, especially going into that Washington game, and particularly coming out of the Washington game because they struggled so much in the red zone. Now, my personal opinion of it is it's sort of a symptom of the disease, so to speak. Auburn's success, again, has been really predicated off forcing the other team to overcompensate to the run game. When Auburn has had something that lets them run the ball, that forces you to put an extra body in the box, that forces you to give up something in the back end, that's when they can get, facing cover one, where if somebody blows an assignment, there's no safety back there, and you end up with a big touchdown. If you can sit with 2 safeties and you can roll into at least cover 2 looks or more exotic zone blitz looks, it's hard for Auburn to get the easy plays they want, because best case scenario, you're throwing into 2 or 3 deep zone coverage in the back end, so it's a long completion, but it ain't going to score. So when they're at their best, they're able to run the ball when they want to run it, and if you can run the ball when you want to run it, you can score in the red zone. And that's played out over time. So in 2014, they had a 65% touchdown percentage in the red zone. 2013, 72%. So very high numbers. And then 2015, it drops off a little bit to 62%. 2016 falls all the way to 56%. Now it doesn't seem like a huge drop, but bear in mind, there's enough weak opponents in everybody's schedule that you're going to have a high touchdown percentage in a lot of your games. So the misses here tend to be in crucial situations. In that 10% drop, if you're looking from, say, 2014 to 2016, is 10% over the season, but it's probably like a 30-40% drop when you're playing ranked teams. Then when you looked at 2017, it went all the way back up to 64%. 2018 dropped down to about 60. What's the common thread here? Well, they're successful seasons. 2017, 2014, 2013, they're all about 65% or higher in red zone scoring percentage in terms of touchdowns. In the years when they're not, they haven't been anywhere near as successful. So that, to me, I think sort of defines Auburn's offense. And when they score a lot of red zone touchdowns, that means the offense is being successful. It means they're able to run the ball. It means when you're in a compressed field position, right, you can't get cheap, easy yards very well. You can't have a play where you fake your zone read and then you got Schwartz streaking down the field. You've got to earn that yardage with traditional offense. And so it's more of an indicator of where the traditional offense is as a baseline. And that offense has to be at just a certain point that's a tipping scale for the defense to over-adjust before everything else that Malzahn wants to do actually starts to work and before they can actually start to move the chains enough to be successful.
So one of the things we touched on early last year was that, regardless of what type of offense he wants to employ, even if he is still enamored with throwing the ball around the yard, he needs a good running game. And we were concerned because there was so few returning contributors in the run game. And so I'll say this. Coming into the season, we said two things about Auburn. One we got right, one I don't think we got as right. We said the wide receivers would be a liability. I don't think that was true. I think they found some decent production from wide receiver, but we were dead on with the running game, and it plagued them all year. So is that a situation where you talked about before where it didn't matter? Excuse me. You said it didn't matter so much about who was running the plays or what talent was back there as much as making sure Malzahn calls the right type of game. Do you think that Auburn is still in the same spot at the running back this year, or the running game, I should say, this year? Or if Malzahn switches back to more of a power run, inverted veer concept, it'll really kind of give the running game a shot in the arm regardless of who's carrying the ball?
I mean, I do think it's a factor. I mean, Whitlow wasn't 100% at all points last year, and I think that was kind of obvious. And you could definitely tell when he didn't get a lot of carries and when he wasn't, operating at a high level, the offense wasn't working very well. In the loss to Tennessee, it was 3.5 yards per carry. Next week, obviously, Ole Miss, that's the cure to everyone's ills. It was about 9 yards per carry. But for the remainder of the season, he didn't hit 4 yards per carry in FBS play. That was the last. Even the Purdue game, Whitlow was only 1.4 yards per carry. So it was a problem. Now, I think Whitlow's a pretty good back. He had his struggles at times. He got banged up. There's a lot to that. I think he's a guy you can kind of lean on to a large extent, but I do think they're going to feel the fact that they don't have a lot of depth. I don't, frankly, have a lot of trust in Cam Martin as a backup. I think maybe some of the younger players can step up. That's sort of a different discussion. But also, you've got the offensive line issues. We talked about the replacements of offensive line and what they were going to be like. They don't have a ton of losses there, but again, they weren't particularly good, so it's hard to say how much of a step forward they're going to take. I do think it's going to be an interesting point. You said we're not going to talk about quarterbacks, and to be clear, what we're not going to really talk about is who's going to win the quarterback battle and what's it going to shape up to be. But I think we can say this. From what we do know, there's definitely going to be some tension between the fact that you've got a 5-star passer in Bo Nix, who from the film, I've watched, or, like their spring game, Nix is a really, really talented passer. And you've got another guy in Gatewood that is a massive guy that's going to be a really good runner. And there's going to be this tension on how much do they need to use Gatewood to make sure the run game is at a certain level versus how much they need to use Nix as a passer to make sure the passing game's at a certain level. And I think I'm going to transition to a point, and then I'll let you respond to this. The statistical thing that I noticed in the past few years is how much the running game sort of has fallen off year to year over the past 3 years and how much the passing game picked up the slack. So stepping through it, now this is yards per game, and usually we talk about yards per attempt, but for these purposes, we're really just focused more on how much of the offense was generated through the run game. Auburn in 2016 was 271 yards per game on the ground. That was 6th nationally. 2017, they were 218 yards per game on the ground. That was 26th nationally. And then last year, they fell to 167 yards per game on the ground. That was 68th nationally. So you went from 6th to 26th to 68th. Now, a lot of that was due to the fact that they weren't necessarily being as successful in 2016 passing the ball, so they had to run it a lot, but that was kind of where the balance was, and you could see it fall off, where they fell out of being a top 50 team even in rushing in 2018. And it was the passing game, though, that's really taken up the slack. So, again, in 2016, they were 112th in the country in yards per game passing. Only 170 yards per game, less than 200 average. 2017, they improved all the way up to 233 yards per game with Jarrett Stidham. That was 65th nationally. So not really elite when you talk about the amount of yardage that was generated, but it was pretty efficient offense, especially in big games. And then the big thing in 2018 is that really didn't slip. It was 222 yards per game, which was only 10 yards per game less than it was the year prior. But the difference was the run game wasn't anywhere near as successful. I mean, they fell off from 218 yards per game to 267. It was a 60 yard per game drop. We're going from 26th to 68th nationally, while the passing game stayed pretty steady. Now, the yards per attempt fell, but it was because they were having to throw the ball more, and they were a lot more reliant on being successful with Stidham. But I'm not sure how many people fully realized that they were, in terms of total yardage, almost exactly as productive in 2018 as 2017, passing the ball. The difference was how much they had to succeed at passing the ball and how much that hurt them. Where am I going with that whole discussion? Well, my concern is the past 2 years, at least what I'm looking at statistically, the passing game made up for a significant drop in the run game. And last year, again, it wasn't a great offensive team, but they've held between 30 to 33 points a game over the past 3 years, where the pass game's really picked up for slack in the run game. If the run game does not improve substantially and the passing game falls off due to departures at receiver and the loss of an NFL quarterback, which even assuming Bo Nix is an NFL quarterback, you're still talking about a true freshman, so this is fairly realistic. I think there's a serious danger that the offense could step back even another step from where it was last year, because the passing game is no longer there to supplement the run game. And if the run game isn't good enough, then I just don't know where the offense comes from.
I wonder, though, even with what I think will be a step back at quarterback, because I was really high on Jarrett Stidham, and I think he was underutilized at Auburn in that scheme. I think that there's an opportunity here with Gus to maybe learn his lesson and employ an offense that, I mean, look, he's had a quarterback turned NFL cornerback for a cup of coffee who tore Alabama to shreds. So he can field an offense with not elite top talent skill position players and still do some damage if he gets his head out of his ass. But the flip side of that, and we're kind of running out of time because we won't go too long on this, but I think Auburn fans are sort of leaning on the fact that they've got a lot of good returning players on defense, and it's true. They're going to have a good defensive line. They're going to get after the quarterback. They're going to have a pretty good secondary, but not an elite secondary. And I wonder if there is maybe a false sense of security even on the defense, because the numbers were good last year, but they didn't play a good offensive team until Texas A&M, and Texas A&M had their own issues. Yes, Ole Miss put up a lot of points against crappy teams, but they couldn't score. They weren't a good offensive team against other SEC teams. LSU was a good team. They were not a good offensive team, and that was in the third week of the season. Gave up 27 to Georgia, gave up 52 to Alabama, and those are really the only two top-tier offenses they played. So I wonder if you're saying there's possibly rain clouds on the horizon with offense, And I'm thinking that maybe the defense is a little bit not as good. Does that mean that we can possibly dispel with this notion that Auburn's going to be a good team with a potentially bad record, and maybe they won't be as good of a team as they're getting credit for because of the hard schedule, if that makes sense?
I think it's entirely possible. So I'm going to take 2 steps back to unpack it and then sort of come to my conclusion, which I think kind of wraps things up a little bit. All right, so taking 2 steps back. One, we have this whole discussion about quarterbacks and my concern with the run game complementing the pass game. The silver lining in all this is my long discussion about the fact that Malzahn tends to gravitate towards installing this pass-first offense because it's what his natural offense was. And then when he's forced to operate a run-first offense, he's been more successful. So I think to a certain degree, the best thing that might happen for him is if he's forced to use Gatewood, and then Gatewood installs a run-first offense that's successful and they ride it, it may force Malzahn to call the kind of plays that he's good at calling at and puts him in his comfort zone. They fix the run game, and then they're very successful. That's your best case scenario. The next step is dealing with the defense. I think the first thing that needs to be, you have to acknowledge, is that Auburn's defensive line may be the best unit in the country. It's going to be definitely one of the best defensive lines in the SEC. That's probably not saying as much as most people would think. Texas A&M, Missouri are hitting the reset button. Those were probably the 2 best run defenses in the SEC. Alabama's defensive line should be good, but it's a little theoretical at this point, and they didn't really produce at as high a level as you would have hoped last year. If you're an Alabama fan, especially when you talk about pass rush at the end of the year. Georgia's defensive line, maybe not that great. And LSU's defensive line last year was, we've talked about this quite a bit. Their run defense was actually pretty much straight average statistically, at the 40s to 60s in most statistics nationally. So Auburn's going to have a real edge over most of the conference, the defensive line. They've got a lot of experience in the secondary. Now, I don't know that those players were necessarily all that great. To your point, they didn't face a lot of elite offenses. The sort of the two-pronged concern there is there's a lack of experience and quality at linebacker relative to what it was last year. I don't doubt that Britt and Tut or whoever steps in there is going to be pretty good, but I think you're fooling yourself if you think that those guys are going to step in and be as good as Deshaun Davis was or Darrell was last year with the experience level they had. Those were very, very good football players. You're going to take some sort of a step back when you lose guys of that caliber. That comes with having really good players. You're not going to be as good when you lose those players. It is what it is. And where I'm going with this is I think we may see something similar. Auburn, in most of their games, is going to dominate because the defensive line's so good. I'm not sure how well the secondary is going to hold up if they're forced to hold up. We saw that against Alabama where they kind of got taken to the woodshed once Alabama started having time to throw the ball. Now, how many teams are going to have the opportunity to do that next year? Probably not a ton. And this finally gets back around to your point. Auburn may end up being a 4 or 5 loss team, and people may look at it and go, well, they only lost to top 15 teams or top 20 teams, and they were otherwise really good. This is, quote, the best 4-loss team in the country. That might be a little deceptive. And the issue with the schedule is I'm not sure how many average teams are really on the schedule. When you look at LSU, Georgia, and Alabama, I think those are elite tier teams. I think Florida and Oregon are probably good, not elite. I'm not sure how good Oregon even is at that extent. It's really, I think the verdict's completely out on what the heck Florida is going to look like next year. Personally, I don't think Texas A&M is going to be as good this year, upcoming year, as they were last year, which is, I know, an unpopular opinion from a lot of people. My view on A&M last year is their run defense was absolutely the strength of the team. The pass defense was terrible. And this year they're going to lose all their talent in the front 7. So I just don't see their defense being anywhere near as good. And I don't have any reason to think the offense is going to be able to pick up the slack. So if that's the case, and let's say Auburn beats an Oregon that's not as good as we think, and A&M that's not as good as we think, they're going to beat Tulane, Kent State. They're going to beat Ole Miss. They're going to beat Sanford. Let's say I'm right about, A&M. I'm right about Mississippi State taking a step back. They beat Arkansas, and then they lose to Florida. They're 8-4. Florida at that point is probably top 15 or flirting with it if they beat Auburn. The Georgia, Alabama games and LSU games are all more or less excusable. And you're looking at an 8-4 mark where, they make a bowl, yeah, maybe they end up a 9-win team if they win their bowl in that scenario where they probably get a pretty easy seed. But at the end of the day, they probably weren't even, there's a good chance they weren't even really all that competitive in the games that they lost. And I feel like that's probably been Malzahn's biggest weakness in a lot of these seasons, is he's repeatedly getting to this 8-win and 9-win mark. The problem is, it's not that he won 9 games or 8 games. It's so many of the games he's losing, they're really not all that close to winning. And that's, I think, the hard pill to swallow, like from the 2016 season or like last year even. They weren't really even close to beating Georgia. They had Alabama in a close game for about a half, and then that one ran completely away from them. Obviously, the Tennessee game last year was completely inexcusable, but let's sort of put that one aside as a one-off. Even Mississippi State, right? I mean, 23-9. I don't think people are going to have a ton of patience with Malzahn if he's continuing to lose in a fashion where, yeah, he gets you to 8 wins or 9 wins, but against the teams that are really good, you get exposed. I think there's a concern with that Kevin Steele because his offense is really solid and they're going to be really good defensively, but they're also pretty vanilla. And I think when they play teams that are good enough to sort of stemmy the pass rush and get and actually dictate the game a little bit, his defense isn't dynamic enough to respond at times. And it's going to be interesting this year to see how all this plays together with Malzahn as the offensive coordinator, to see how much the defensive line can really compensate for the rest of the defense, especially the really young linebacking core. And at the end of the day, just to see if they can score a lot more points than they did last year, which is really what was holding them back.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to have you do a prediction since these are previews. I think it's fair that we go on record as what we think of what type of team they're going to be. I think that you're right. There's 2 things. There's your record, and then there's how competitive you are against the best teams. And I'll put it like this. I think Auburn goes 8-4. I think they go 8-4 and split A&M and Florida. At Kyle Field early in the year, Kellen Mond, if he's on, he's on. It's going to be a tough game. It was a close game last year. And then at Florida. So they get like a trash team at home, in my opinion. Mississippi State is going to be trash this year. I shouldn't say that. I said that before. I'm sorry. I don't say trash anymore. I don't think Mississippi State's going to be very good. They had a not good offense last year, and they lost a lot of defensive production. But yeah, so I think Auburn goes 8-4. I think the only way Gus Malzahn keeps his job is if they go 8-4, and that 8th win is against Alabama, and then they win their bowl game and go 9-4 with a win over Alabama. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think they're going to lose to Alabama, Georgia, LSU, and split A&M and Florida, and that's a best case scenario. And this is largely because of a lot of the unknowns. If you had Jarrett Stidham back there and a good running back crew, I'd be a little more optimistic, but right now I'm not. So why don't you give me your prediction, and then we can wrap this one up.
So my prediction pretty much mirrors yours exactly. I think they're probably going to finish 8-4. Like you, I think they're probably going to drop LSU, Georgia, and Alabama. I think those teams are probably just a little bit too good for them. And at the end of the day, I think they probably end up splitting. Like you said, in my view, it's Oregon, Texas A&M, and Florida. I think the Oregon opener, I'm a little higher on Oregon than you are. We'll do a preview of that game, which is why we haven't gone too much detail about it. I do think Herbert's very good. You have to remember that their offensive line was very badly injured last year, and that Herbert had an injured shoulder. So Oregon was better than they looked if you just look off one-off games. If you're an Auburn fan and you're prepping for the season, go watch an early game from Oregon, not a late one. They were badly beat up offensively in general, and Herbert was injured late in the year. It's not really a fair representation of that team. But I just think it's too much to ask. And you sort of, the shame of this is they could go 9-3, and I think if they went 9-3, you probably have to keep Malzahn, and you may say, look, they lost to 3 top 10 teams. This was a little bit of a dip year. It is what it is. And at that point, you've beaten Florida, you've beaten A&M, you've beaten Oregon. It's going to look like more or less a successful year. But they could just as easily go 7-5. If they drop Oregon, that's probably what you're staring at. And then that's going to be deemed a failure. He's going to be fired. I think the 8-4 scenario is going to be really tough because it's going to leave the fan base divided. Because on one hand, you can say, well, he lost games that were really hard. He had a very, very difficult schedule to navigate. He beat pretty much all the teams he should have and beat a couple other good teams.
Yeah, is 8-4 with a win over Georgia like the worst nightmare for Auburn fans this year?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if it was 8-4 and a win over Georgia, then it's going to leave everyone completely divided, right? I mean, in one hand, it's a victory, but it's not the victory they want, which is over Alabama. It still means that you dropped a couple games you probably shouldn't have lost to, which was the cardinal sin that the Tennessee loss has put him in this position, more or less. If they'd beaten Tennessee last year's season would have probably been viewed as an overall success, even if it didn't quite meet their goals. But now they need to do something a little bit better. That's the thing.
But if he doesn't beat Tennessee last year, then he gets a better bowl opponent. So that's also, what you're saying here is interesting to me because I'm thinking, I at first I was being a little bit generous and thinking 8-4, but then now I'm looking at like, what if Oregon is really good? What if they're a top 10 team? They could be. What if Auburn then has another Tennessee-like game from last year that they drop along the way? Then at least if you're an Auburn fan, you've got clarity. Because then you're looking at 6-6, and your 6 wins are against Tulane, Kent State, Arkansas, Ole Miss, and Samford type teams, Mississippi State. Like, then you're feeling pretty good because you know you've got clarity and you're moving on beyond Gus Malzahn. Or you want 11-2 with an LSU and a Georgia win type season. The worst thing ever is probably, I hate to say it, what they're probably going to get. They're going to get 8-4. They've got a lot of talent on that team. They've got some people that are used to winning, and they've got some coaches that are used to winning. They're going to win some ball games this year. And I think it's going to leave everybody on both sides really dissatisfied. So are you going with, okay, you're saying 8-4. Give me their 4 losses so we can have it on record.
The 4 losses to me are LSU, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And the reason for that being, I think LSU, Georgia, and Alabama are going to be too much for them if LSU is what I think they are. In the Florida game, it's just going to be tough to play at Texas A&M, then Mississippi State, which, if nothing else, is always a physical game, and then play at Florida the next week. It's a 3-game stretch. It's going to be at the Swamp. And now Auburn's had a tremendous amount of success over the years in Florida. They've had a lot of big wins and a lot of big upsets at Florida. But that's a tough spot schedule-wise. And then, a couple of weeks later at LSU in Death Valley, before going on, what is also a little bit of a, stretch run in terms of having LSU, Georgia, and Alabama as 3 of your last 5 games is pretty rough.
And it sucks that Auburn, with this brutal schedule, and their dadgum bye week is before Arkansas. Like that's the knife in the belly right there.
Well, they do get. Remember, you do get a second bye, so they do get a bye too before Georgia because this is a double bye year.
But in that stretch that we were talking about, the A&M, Mississippi State, and Florida, that's when you want a bye week. Like you don't want to. Yes, a bye week between. So LSU, Ole Miss, which is an easy game, bye week Georgia makes that stretch a little better, and then bye week Alabama, it does. But I hate that bye week before Arkansas. Maybe because of you are going to be beaten up after Florida, so maybe that's good. It maybe helps you to not drop a game against in Arkansas. But gosh, if you're an Auburn fan, you'd love to see one before Mississippi State or Florida because that's a brutal stretch. All right, y'all. I think I'm on the record 8-4. Josh is on the record 8-4, and that means that Auburn fans, if it plays out that way, will be fighting on them message boards and mostly dissatisfied. If anything, from Auburn fans that I love very much, that I work with and live near, I almost want a 4-8 for you, and not saying that I would take joy in that, but I think I would take joy in you finally getting some clarity because you've been mired in ambiguity this whole time under Gus Malzahn. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging with us for this long-ish preview of Auburn Tigers 2019 football season. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Y'all have a good week. God bless.